Osawatomie, Kansas, the city of history and promise. It's our second summer doing this. I am really excited to kind of see how this plays out. Um, just thinking about random people that I could possibly talk to, and I've really been pushing myself outside the boundaries here, trying to think of new and unique people to speak with, and well, let's just give it a go. This is this is so exciting.
Hi.
Hey, Kermit,
Yes, how's it going?
it's going really, really well. I'm really encouraged and excited, and I'm very thankful that you decided to share some of your time with me this morning. I'm very, very thankful, and it's very good to finally meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Um,
My pleasure.
yeah, well, I know you're wildly busy. So currently you're the David Bergen Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. What exactly does that entail? Does that mean like you're like one step away from emeritus and they're kicking you out, or what?
No, no, no. Um, you mean the chair?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, so you go through a bunch of different phases as a law professor. So first you're hired, you're an assistant professor, you're tenure track, and then after 5 years, they evaluate you for tenure, and if they give you tenure, then you're a full professor. And then at some point thereafter, often it sort of depends on the school and depends on who else is there. Um, they give you a named chair,
Okay.
which
So
is
it's
just sort of a,
similar to mathematics. So my background's mathematics. I went to the University of Kansas and I got my undergrad in mathematics and then decided to go teach high school. But I'm familiar with academia as far as mathematics goes, but not with law. So did you get a doctorate in law at some point
no,
along the
this is one
way?
of the weird things about law, which makes it academically a little bit less respectable. I think so.
Okay.
One, like people don't have advanced degrees in law. You have your law degree, and that's all you need to
Oh,
teach.
wow.
Increasingly, people are getting PhDs.
Yeah.
Not in law. Usually, there is a law PhD program at Yale, but usually people get PhDs in some other subject like history or economics or something like that.
That makes more sense.
Um, and then, they have all of this interdisciplinary expertise that they can bring to the study of law. But then the problem is most publication of legal scholarship is in student edited law reviews. So you actually have the students deciding what gets published and the students edit it,
Okay.
which is not a great model for scholarship.
Yeah, that's that you're letting the kids decide
Yeah.
really what's
You,
going on.
Yeah, so
And
the second year students at Harvard who are smart students and they try their best, but they're just not familiar with the scholarship, so they can't really evaluate.
right, and they don't have 15 years of research under their belt, and they haven't you know gone through all that. Oh, that's really interesting. That is not where I anticipated this conversation going. I just thought it was really really interesting because you work at a university, so and I have never experienced somebody on that side at the university before, mainly because I just stick to math and that's about it.
Yeah.
Um, so I emailed you because I do this podcast in my town, right? So Osawatomie, Kansas. It's fairly rural. It's about an hour south of Kansas City. The town itself was founded in the mid 1500s by a companies out of New England that were pushing abolitionist ideals.
Oh yeah.
And so a bunch of companies hired some people to come out to Kansas to be abolitionists. And Osawatomie was one of them. Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is at, is another one. And there's a couple of other cities that were founded that way. And the people that started this town came here knowing full well that pro-slavery militias and groups were, I mean, really surrounding this area.
hmm
And so that's where the story of John Brown comes into play. John Brown comes here and there's the Battle of Osawatomie. There's massacres back and forth across the border between here and Missouri. And then obviously the Civil War happens, which is where I think I think you're a very interesting person to talk to because I've been learning about your book. I didn't get an opportunity to read your book, but you wrote a book in the last, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, where you discuss a new way of thinking about America and the founding fathers. Now, I'm going to give a quick synopsis, and I'm doing way too much talking here, but a quick synopsis.
Just
Yes,
hold
the
up the
nation
book
that
for
never
you.
was. Yeah, that's the book, right? That's the book. So you say that our founding fathers and the documents that you've studied through those founding fathers is very exclusive. And then after Abraham Lincoln and throughout Reconstruction, the ideals become inclusive. And it's really in the wording of the documents, especially you say like the Gettysburg Address, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, all become very inclusive. What made you want to write that book, and what made you see that specifically as being exclusive versus inclusive?
Well, it all sort of started, I guess, with rereading the Declaration of Independence and thinking about it more and thinking about what people have said about it. So, um, like 10 years ago, or actually like 12 years ago now, I think, the Texas Law Review asked me to write a book review of two books by Yale Law professor Jack Balkin,
Okay.
who was one of my professors when I was a student, has been a mentor and a friend over the years. Um, and he was talking about constitutional theory and constitutional interpretation, but along the way, he said a fair amount about Abraham Lincoln and the use that Lincoln makes of the Declaration. And the idea that the Constitution exists to embody the ideals of the Declaration, and the idea that the fundamental ideal of the Declaration is equality. So that the Declaration is at its heart a statement of this principle of universal human equality. And you see Lincoln saying that, and you see Martin Luther King saying that very strikingly in the March on Washington. Um, but I was thinking about, how does the argument of the Declaration actually work? What does it mean? So I looked at it more closely, and I was like, if you look at this from Jefferson's perspective, if you think about what people are trying to do in 1776 and what it would have made sense for them to say, and what the sort of political theory of the time was, it's kind of easy to see what the Declaration is doing in terms of independence, but it's really not doing what we now think in terms of equality. And then I was like, and there are lots of other things in American history that support this. So you look at the Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court is construing that pre-Civil War Constitution and saying it forbids black people from US citizenship. And you look at what the Declaration says about slavery and about outsiders generally. It talks about slave rebellions as a threat to the colonists. It doesn't say slavery is bad. It talks about foreign mercenaries. It talks about Native Americans and calls them merciless savages. So it's got this very negative view of outsiders. So then I was thinking, it looks like our founding documents don't necessarily bear the weight that we're trying to put on them. I wonder if there's another source, right? Because if there's nothing else, and this is sort of the position Abraham Lincoln was in, I think, if there's nothing else, you make the best of what you have. And Lincoln was a sort of anti-slavery constitutionalist, and he thought the Declaration was a strong statement for equality, but he had no other resources.
Mm.
And then, right, you get the Civil War, you get the Reconstruction Amendments, and now we ban slavery. And now we say states must recognize the equal rights of people. And we say everyone born in the United States is a citizen. So now we've got this commitment to equality and inclusion and democracy, and also sort of important redistribution, like redistribution in the name of equality. We get that too. But we get all of that from Reconstruction. And so then it seemed like this really interesting puzzle to me. Why do people after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, like Martin Luther King in 1963, why are they still talking about the Declaration of Independence and not the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? And then, and this is a long answer, I know, but here's like a
No,
really
it's
interesting
good.
payoff, I think.
Please.
Then there's this amazing thing about Martin Luther King, which is when he was a junior in high school, he enters an oratory competition with a speech called The Negro and the Constitution, which is basically about the same thing as the I Have a Dream speech, which is what determines how Black people in America deserve to be treated. And it's all about Reconstruction. It's all about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and what a radical change they made in the system that the founders designed. And then by 1963, he's saying something very different. And why is that? It's because I think we have this idea that we can bring Americans together in the name of the founding. We can get everyone to say the Declaration of Independence speaks to me. And you can't get people to do that about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You can't get people to do that about Reconstruction.
Mm.
Reconstruction is divisive. And then my big takeaway is we need to move past this. Like, we should be ready now to say Reconstruction is the birth of our America. Reconstruction is the birth of the values that we now believe in. And we should think more about Reconstruction and less about the founding.
Okay, this is a I don't know. I don't know where this I don't know how to frame this question. So there's a wide view about he who owns the story owns the history type of, I don't remember the phrasing is not right. I don't have the right phrasing. But there's the people that put the textbooks in in high schools, the people that wrote those textbooks and the things that they said are now are are you in an argument of which we need to alter the way we're thinking about Reconstruction and post Civil War history, that 20-30 year period after the Civil War? Or are you saying that, I guess I'm having a hard time framing this question in a way that makes sense, because in my mind, I'm thinking about, like, all of the statues of Confederates and Confederate soldiers and things of that
Mm-hmm.
nature, and holding on to the heritage of the South, and because I grew up in Houston, I grew up in my parents are both from Louisiana. We know very much the Southern gentlemanly type of a way, heritage matters type of a thing. And I'm kind of wondering if that's a rewriting of the like, are you trying to like refocus the history of that point? Or are you just just giving people an opportunity to examine the Reconstruction?
Well, I'm giving people an opportunity to rethink things. I'm trying to give them a different perspective. And that's all that I have the power to do, really. But then in
Okay.
terms of like the influence that I would like to have, what I would like to see happen, I would like to see the way that we teach US history at the high school level change. Like, that would be success for me.
Yeah.
So, people have formulated this in lots of different ways, but um, I think it's Orwell who says, he who controls the past controls the future. He who
No.
controls the present controls the past. And that's what I think, in large part, the school curriculum wars that are going on now are about. So there's like a moral panic LGBT aspect to it, but a lot of it is about race and history. And
Mhm.
very tellingly, there's a Florida law that says American history shall be presented as the development of a nation based on the universal principles of the Declaration of Independence, which is like exactly what I say just didn't happen, right? That's not how it happens.
Yeah.
But they're saying public school teachers must teach this version of history that says America is born in 1776 with the Declaration, and we're the same nation that we always were. And what I would like to see happen is people to pay less attention to 1776 and then to say 1863, the Gettysburg Address, or 1868, the 14th Amendment. That's really a fundamental break. And
Mhm.
the character of America changed, and we're really a new nation. Maybe for the first time, we are a nation. Before the Civil War, we're kind of a confederacy. We're a league of states. And I think we really downplay the extent to which the Civil War and Reconstruction are, in my mind, a revolution. And we kind of destroy the earlier political order. And the Reconstruction Congress doesn't want to say that they're doing that, because you don't like to say that usually. So
Yeah,
they
that'd be
say
kind of
that
blasphemous.
they're fulfilling the vision of the founders, but
Right.
really I don't think they are if you look at it closely.
That's
So
really
then
fascinating.
the statues question,
Right.
which is also super interesting. So, one, what do you do about Confederate statues? I think the Confederate statues should basically come down. And the reason for that is that if you look at when they went up, there's like a wave of statues, North and South, right after the Civil War, not necessarily for particular generals or anything, but like it's the soldier. And they're
Right.
like, gosh, lots of people died. We're very sad about this. We want to commemorate the loss that the nation suffered, which is totally
Correct.
legitimate. But then, when Reconstruction starts losing, when the integrated Reconstruction governments in the South start getting overwhelmed by the white supremacist paramilitaries, the Klan and the red shirts, Confederate statues go up again. And now they're honoring particular generals and heroes of the
Mhm.
Confederacy. And it's not really about heritage or these were brave men who sought to do right as God gave it to them to see the right. It's more like white supremacy. You may have won the war, but we're winning the peace.
Yeah. Oh,
And
that's interesting.
you can see that very vividly by who they choose to honor. So you got a
That
bunch of Confederate generals. You
you know
probably
it.
know what I'm going to say. Are you?
No, no. Go ahead.
Okay. So you got a bunch of Confederate generals who do sort of the same thing during the Civil War, right? Which is they fight bravely for the South, um, and then afterwards they do different things. So very big difference between, say, James Longstreet, who is like Lee's second in command, very important Confederate general, and Nathan Bedford Forrest. So during the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest is notable for being an innovative cavalry tactician and deserves some credit for that, I guess, and also for being involved in the Fort Pillow massacre, where Confederate troops slaughter captured and defenseless black Union soldiers.
Oh,
Um, After the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest becomes the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
okay.
So he
That's
doesn't
fast.
last very long. He actually doesn't really like the organization. They're undisciplined. But for a while at least, he's the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And James Longstreet says, you know what, the Civil War changed things. We tried it. You know, we asserted our independence. We fought for our independence. We lost. Now I accept the new order. And he actually starts working with the Republicans. And he commands the integrated Louisiana militia and New Orleans police force fighting against this white supremacist paramilitary in what they call the Battle of Liberty Place, where the defenders are overwhelmed and the white supremacists overrun New Orleans, and it takes the federal army to drive them away. But there you've got two Confederate generals fighting bravely for the South. After the Civil War, one of them goes the white supremacist terrorist route, one of them goes the we're all one country now route, reconciliation. And there are no statues at all, basically, of James Longstreet. And Nathan Bedford Forrest is everywhere. So in Tennessee, Nathan Bedford
Fascinating.
Forrest has more statues than the three presidents from Tennessee combined.
That is
All
fascinating.
of which is to say, Confederate statues are really ideologically about white supremacy.
Right. Right. Well, and I like that you draw the distinction between the soldier monuments to recognize the great bloodshed of the Civil War, right?
Which is
And
totally
which
legit. Yeah.
absolutely. And I don't know that there's a single human being in the world that would say, "Hey, you don't want to celebrate those people." Uh but
Well,
I
Thaddeus Stevens.
do.
Thaddeus Stevens. So, you know, right during Reconstruction, when the wounds are still sort of raw,
Yeah.
someone is saying now they are the common dead of the nation. And Thaddeus Stevens, who I think is an underappreciated American hero, did say those Confederate dead are traitors and they killed loyal Americans. And if the Americans that they killed could hear you talking about them as collectively America's honored dead, they would rise from their tombs and make your eyeballs bleed. Um,
That's
you
aggressive.
know, and
But
that's a perspective too.
that is, it is. But I think modern day Americans would have to recognize that it was Americans and Americans fighting against Americans.
Yeah, it was Americans fighting against Americans, and I think I probably blame the leadership of the Confederacy a lot more than the rank and file, because you know, in on the part of the Confederacy, it was to a pretty significant extent like a rich man's fight and a poor man's war.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, wow. I had never heard that one before.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from. I didn't make it up, but
Very good.
I, you know, like it's very common right? The
Right.
rich people have economic interests and they make the poor people die for them.
You know that okay, you know what, this is a theme that I've been, so I emailed you about a week ago and
Actually, I got that backwards. I'm sorry. It's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The poor people are the ones who do the fighting.
right.
That's how you say it.
Right. Well, the message is clear. But you know, there's a theme that, so in the last week, whenever I emailed you, I was like, hey, I wonder if he would actually do this. I have been just immersing myself in all things Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, especially with what's going on here in town. And what I think is really fascinating and absolutely fascinating, it's almost like a fish swimming upstream, is that your family comes from great wealth, and yet you're fighting for everyday man, right? The common person. And it comes from Teddy credits his father as being somebody who instilled this idea of public service, this idea of fighting for the everyday man, the working man. And I find that to be absolutely counterintuitive and inspiring, because um, he doesn't apologize for who he is in any way, shape, or form, which I nobody should. But he recognizes where he comes from. He recognizes what opportunities he's been given, but he also accepts the responsibility for doing a greater good. And I find that to be absolutely admirable in his pursuits. How does that translate today with you specifically? And is that still kind of a core theme with you and your family?
Yeah, I think that public service is a core theme. I mean that is something that I sort of feel. The great wealth kind of dissipated,
Sure.
um, but so like Theodore Roosevelt, I think, inherited a lot of money, which he didn't necessarily steward all that well. Um, so his descendants have less money, but they have the family name and the reputation.
Sure.
And I think that that in some ways works sort of similarly, because even more so maybe having like a family reputation based on who your ancestors are is a kind of privilege that you can understand is artificial and not earned, not because of anything that you did. And
Right.
so seeing the way that that operates in my own life, in the way that it did operate, I think maybe makes it easier for me to see other systems of privilege as artificial.
That makes sense. That makes
Um,
sense. No, there's a strong argument for merit as well. Whenever I think of Teddy Roosevelt, I think about a merit or meritocracies, even where I mean, he is forcefully saying at every step along the way, you work for you need to put effort, energy, you need to work for the country, you need to work for your neighbors, you need to build your communities. And like my father growing up always would say things like to be a contributing member of society, right? I don't know who coined that phrase or when it happened, but it's very wildly important to me, because it's something that I heard consistently all throughout growing up, is to be a contributing member of society. And I changed the word society to community, because this is a town of 4,500. So growing up in Houston of 4 million people to here with 4,500 people, my community has changed a little bit. But you have to be, the I guess the core of it is to have service to your community. And I absolutely respect that was a thorough thread throughout his whole entire. Um, all right, so I have to say this, and I want to say this in a way that is no way, shape, or form uh uh um derogatory. But when I like listening, reading, watching everything about Teddy Roosevelt, all I can think about is Forrest Gump. And here's why. Right? The only difference between Teddy Roosevelt and Forrest Gump in my mind is that Teddy Roosevelt worked so hard and was more driven than anybody else. And Forrest Gump just kind of backed his way into all of it, right? So when I watched and I almost started making a list of all of the things that Teddy Roosevelt went through and did,
Hmm.
and like it parallels, right, with Forrest Gump. He struggled. He was struggled as a young man. He had to build his strength up. Much like Forrest Gump had his magic shoes and stuff, and he had a streak that, as an athlete in college, where Teddy was a boxer. There's all sorts of just interesting little like nuances and things. We look at Forrest Gump like, oh my gosh, there's no way somebody was there for every single one of those events. But whenever I go back and think about it, Teddy Roosevelt he was there for so many different things throughout his period of time there. What do you see that parallel? Do you see like how did he get involved with that and this and this and this and this?
Yeah, I do. Um, Teddy Roosevelt had, like 6 or 7 dimensions, each of which would have been a notable career for a person and like a notable impact on the country and on American history. Yeah, so that's amazing. And he did like do an incredible amount and was there at all these moments. And you do sort of wonder, like, how could one person do all of that?
Right.
Um, yeah.
Is he? Do you think like where does all this energy come from? Where did that like? Do you ever think to it like when you think about Teddy Roosevelt? To you, like being a descendant, do you feel the weight of the responsibility? Not a lot of responsibility, but do you feel the weight and the pressure to live up to something like that, or do you see it more of like, man, that was really cool. Now I got to turn around and go do whatever it is that I got to do tomorrow, or let me go grab my Starbucks on the way to work. Like, the, like when you think about it, does that hit you different?
I think of it more as like that's really cool. So, I think maybe being as many generations away as I am helps with that. Because,
Sure.
if it's your dad, then you're super in his shadow and how do you live up to that?
Right.
Whereas now I'm like, well, one, obviously, like I can't live up to that. I'm not going to measure myself against Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
But on the other hand, I can be like, hey, that's an inspirational figure. And actually, I have some connection, and maybe there's some of that in me. And when I encounter a setback, I'm like, look at what TR did.
Yeah.
He overcame much more than that. So it's good for me, I think.
Oh, good. That's cool. Another really dumb question that I can't help but ask, and I'm sure you're annoyed with it, but at what point in your life, what was the moment where you went, "Oh, Teddy Roosevelt's that I'm related to that guy"? At what point in your life did that realization hit you?
I can't remember. I mean, it would have been from a very early age, I
Okay.
guess, because like I grew up with a fair amount of Teddy Roosevelt stuff around.
Mm.
One of the books that I liked a lot when I was a kid was this sort of comic book called The Roosevelt Bears. And it
Okay.
was Teddy B and Teddy G, like a brown bear and a gray bear, and they go around and have adventures. And I was like, oh, yes, it's Teddy Roosevelt, my great great grandfather.
Oh, okay. So
Um,
it's always been a part of your conscience.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
as far back as I can remember.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know if it was like you were in college or something at a frat party and somebody was like, "Hey, you got that name?" And like, "No, I don't. Like, leave me alone." And you're like, "Yeah, no." No, but really look, like, okay. I didn't know if there's like a fun story with that or not. So here's a thing that I was reading through. Now the reason why we're talking, right? I live in Osawatomie, Kansas. So Teddy Roosevelt left office in what 1908, and he went on this world tour through Africa, which was incredibly like wildly famous. Apparently, it was traveled with like a big news corps followed him around the whole time. While he was in Africa, he gets a note from his secretary or whoever was traveling with him that said, on such and such date in late August, you're going to Emporia, Kansas. Right, it was a pit stop already there. Would you dedicate the John Brown Park in Osawatomie? All right, so somehow the dedication to the park here in Osawatomie somebody was like, maybe we'll ask Teddy to do this, which is wild because he's the most famous person on earth. That's like asking Taylor Swift right now if she wanted to come by Osawatomie real quick and do to do a set.
I'd like that.
Yeah, that would be cool, right?
I'd come for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so he says sure. And I think, after looking at it over the last, week or so, and over the few years, whenever I think about Osawatomie and especially that instance, I feel like at that time Teddy was doing everything he could to make as many speeches along the route as possible. And especially since he came back from Africa, he wanted to get back in the game. So saying yes to the Osawatomie dedication to the park here in Osawatomie, I think was just an afterthought of, yeah, sure, I'm saying yes to everything. Now, when he got here and gave the new nationalism speech, that was a big time game changer. And what's really fascinating is that in that speech, he talks about the ideals of the founding fathers and the shifting during Reconstruction, which is precisely what your book is about. The shifting of ideals from the founding fathers to where we're at, from the Declaration of Independence to Reconstruction. And my question to you is, have you read through the New Nationalism speech, and are there parts of it that you've seen that speak to that very particular ideal of switching the nation after Reconstruction?
Um, yeah. So, I think it's great that he talks about the importance of the Civil War and
Mm.
Reconstruction. He's still, and it's 1910, so this is not at all surprising, but he's still kind of both sidesing the Civil War, in my
Oh,
view.
interesting.
He's talking about, well, what does he say? It was a heroic struggle. It had also a dark and terrible side. Very much was done of good and much also of evil, and often the same man did both good and evil. Um, and he says, we can admire the heroic valor, the sincerity, the self devotion shown alike by the men who wore the blue and the men who wore the gray, and our sadness that such men should have to fight one another. Which, like I was saying, I guess I have sympathy for the rank and file of the Confederacy, maybe, like the poor men who didn't own slaves themselves, but got drafted into this war. But it was a war in defense of slavery.
Right.
And so I don't view the two sides as both equally praiseworthy. I think that, fighting a war to end slavery is noble and admirable, and that's a great American origin story. And we're like, our nation was born in a war to end slavery. Wonderful. But there were also Americans fighting and dying to defend slavery, and we can't really look at them as the same. So he's doing that, and then he also is saying, in name we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but we gave the lie by our acts to the words of the Declaration of Independence until 1865, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is just not true. Um,
Interesting.
I mean, this anti-slavery reading of the Declaration emerged starting around, really in the 1820s. I think that's when it becomes strong and popular. Um, and antebellum America is not giving the lie to the words of the Declaration of Independence. What they're doing is perfectly consistent with the words of the Declaration of Independence. And then you really get people who live out the true meaning of the Declaration of Independence, not in 1865, in 1861 when the South secedes. Because what are they doing? They are declaring their independence. And
Right.
why are they doing it? Because they signed up in a union that had a constitution that protected slavery, and they're like, you are not giving us what we agreed to, right? The national government and free states, you're not protecting slavery the way you're supposed to. You're not respecting us, which is basically what the colonists were saying to King George, right? We had a form of government. It was supposed to be protecting our natural rights. Um, and you're not doing that. The government's not working. We're going to take our inherent authority over ourselves and we're going to establish a new form of government. Exactly what the Confederates are doing. So, like, the Confederates are the real heirs, I think, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And when you fight a war against people and say, we will not let you leave our country, right? We reject your independence. You are not fulfilling the Declaration of Independence, you're rejecting it. So this is one of the points at which I'm like, our story is kind of backwards.
Mm,
Who's fighting on the side of the Declaration of Independence in the Civil War? Lincoln says it's him in the Gettysburg Address.
right.
Um, he says it's a test of whether a nation dedicated to the ideal that all men are created equal can long endure. But that's not the ideal of the Declaration. The ideal of the Declaration is self-determination and revolution. And a nation that is dedicated to that principle can't long endure because people will secede, just like the Southerners did. And what you have to do is actually beat down that idea and kill it. And we did. And we don't talk about the Declaration of Independence as revolution so much anymore, right? We've put this idea of equality onto it, that it
Mm.
really stands for equality rather than revolution.
So that is really quite fascinating. So at what point does it quit becoming the Declaration of Independence? I apologize. I was in my mind, I was confusing the Declaration and the Constitution.
People do
Because
that.
you're right, the Declaration itself, very much revolutionary. Absolutely. And the Constitution is then there uh to make it last, right? So you have to have
Yeah,
this
so
turn and then you have to make it last. And you're absolutely right. The Declaration of Independence is very much the revolutionary piece. Uh and yeah, I guess I would have to absolutely agree with you on that.
right. So how do you build a nation on those principles? Well, it's sort of tricky, but they kind of tried. So our conventional wisdom is the Constitution that was written in 1787 was trying to take the ideals of the Declaration and give them the force of law, make them real rules that we followed.
Mhm.
And that's not true at all if you think that the Declaration is about equality, because the Constitution that they wrote in 1787 doesn't do anything really to protect the liberty or equality of individuals. It's really
Right.
more about interstate relations, state national government kind of stuff. But if you think that the Declaration is about revolution, they kind of did try to do that. Not as much as some people wanted. So James Madison wanted to put the right of revolution in the preamble to the Constitution. And they didn't end up doing that because maybe they saw it was a really bad idea. But
Yeah.
that's what Madison was thinking. And then Madison also writes Federalist 46, where he says, yes, we're creating this new national government and it looks kind of big and strong and scary, but don't worry, the states will always be more important than the national government and they will defeat it in a war if necessary. And if the
Mhm.
national government tries to interfere with the way that the states want to run their societies, and Madison, a slave owner from Virginia, is thinking about slavery here, if the national government tries to interfere, the states will resist. It will be just like the revolution. 13 states will fight the national government, and of course, they'll win. And that's just about exactly what happens.
Right.
So if you accept the Confederate claims to Missouri and Kentucky, and they made those claims in part because they wanted 13, right? Then you get 13 states. And the first flag of the Confederacy is 13 stars in a circle, just
Mm.
like the Betsy Ross flag, because they're really trying to say, we are the true Americans, we are the revolutionaries, we are fighting for the principles of the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
And during the Civil War, they celebrate the 4th of July. They say, we're the true heirs, we stand in the shoes of the signers. Eventually, they give up on it. They're like, 4th of July, it's tainted by
Yeah. Right.
Yankeedom or something. But in their 1861 secession letters, they invoke the Declaration a lot.
Hmm. Wow. That's really fascinating. I I I'm I appreciate the education. Like this has been one of the coolest conversations I've had in a long time. So one thing that I found to be really interesting is when when Teddy Roosevelt gave his new nationalism speech, it was jarring at the time, right? This is August of 1910, and he is asking for I wish I had that list available. He's asking for all sorts of things, um, like health care for everybody. He's asking for an 8-hour work day. He's asking for women's suffrage. He's asking for Like there's some electoral processes that he wanted to have changed as well.
Yeah,
And
he wants the senators elected by the people.
right, direct Senate. Yeah, exactly. And when I look through that list, it's 124 years old now. And when I look at that list, the only thing that he did not get was national health care, which
Mhm.
you looking back 100 years later, we don't think of what he was saying as being very progressive. But in the moment, at that time, it really was. That was a huge swing. And I think it's really fascinating that it happened here in Osawatomie. And here's why. Because this town was created by free state free state companies out of Massachusetts. It was really put on the map when John Brown you know when he went through his campaign to try and end slavery and the abolitionist movements of the 1850s and 60s. Then Teddy Roosevelt shows up with this extremely progressive view in rural Kansas. And like to me, it seems out of pocket. When you think of Kansas, it is a very conservative, very red state. But some of the most progressive things in our country have happened here, and most literally in my backyard, which is kind of an interesting thing. It's to me, I think it's quite fascinating. And even up to 2 years ago, where Kansas was the first state to to write in some laws about or to have a public vote, excuse me, about abortion rights.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's a very fascinating state. It's a fascinating place to be. And I almost wonder if Teddy had any clue what he was doing when he said when he chose Osawatomie to give such a progressive speech. Do you have any idea on that at all? Do you have any way of speaking to that?
Well, I don't have any sort of direct knowledge,
Right. I mean,
but
obviously.
I mean, if you want to say Teddy was kind of thinking the way that I'm thinking, he just couldn't say it, then it would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if he was thinking that the Civil War was sort of a break and a decisive step forward for America, where we rejected some of the bad old values of founding America, like slavery, um, it would make a whole lot of sense to be like, now we have a similar sort of battle. And I think, you know, the political ideology that he's putting forward here is definitely on what I would call the inclusive egalitarian side rather than the exclusive individualist side. So I think he's fighting for the same values. I mean, if you think that there's a persistent struggle through American history between sort of two different visions of what society should be like, which I do,
Mhm.
and the founding is sort of on one side and Reconstruction is on the other side, or the Confederacy is on one side and the Union is on the other side. He's continuing to push the values of the Union and the values of Reconstruction here, I think, and FDR did it too.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I think that new nationalism speech almost handed FDR like so it's like whenever you just go through the list of things that he wanted to do, FDR it was a roadmap basically for FDR to drag us out of the depression and through the war.
yeah, very much.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. So every time that you I know I'm stealing so much of your time this morning and I'm so sorry, but you're super fascinating to talk to. Every time that you like sit down and like eat a steak, or I don't know if you're vegetarian, do you think Teddy for the FDA and taking care of us for that?
I don't, but I should.
Okay. I'm
I
just
mean,
wondering.
there are so many ways in which he transformed America that I'm
Right.
not as aware of them as I should be every time I interact with them.
Yeah.
Every time I go to a national park, I didn't think
Right.
about that. But yeah, the FDA, right? Why is your food safe?
So let's talk about the national parks for a second. Teddy dedicated a city park here for John Brown Memorial. It was at the time a city park. Um, and we are currently, as you and I speak here on what is this? June 28th. We are currently in the process of getting John Brown Park to become a national park. And so the ties between Teddy Roosevelt dedicating John Brown Park over 100 years ago to where we're at now to making it become a national park, I think are really quite interesting. And it's really fascinating. And I think it's a cool time to be a part of it. So I know that this is so far off your
Thanks.
radar, but in my mind, I want to have you come and dedicate the national park. I think it would be the coolest experience in the world to have another Roosevelt dedicate this, and not only just because it's that the new nationalism speech and all that is fine, but I think the ties between the national park and conservationism and everything that he stood for, I think the symbolism would be absolutely unbelievable. I'm not going to ask for a commitment here now, but if that in any way piques your interest, I would absolutely talk to anybody and everybody. If we do get this national park, I would argue to have you come and dedicate that park.
Yeah, actually, I totally want to do that.
Do you? Ah, that's so cool.
When would that be? No, because I was just thinking as you were talking, I was like, wait, there are all of these incredibly interesting connections, and I
Yes,
should write about it.
yes, you
Um,
should.
yeah,
Yes,
I would
please.
love to do that. But then, like, hey, why don't I write a speech and give the speech? I
Yes,
could do that.
yes, you could.
Um, yeah, yeah. So when would this be?
That's a great question. Well, we have to get it approved. And once it gets approved, I will be talking to every single person that has any say in anything about getting you here for that time. I honestly, I would just, I think that would be the neatest thing in the world, to have you come down and dedicate the park. I personally, I just think that would be awesome. So,
Yeah, I do too.
okay,
I would love
cool.
to do that. I mean,
Yes. Ah,
depends on
great.
the scheduling.
Sure, of course,
Because
obviously,
I'm a
obviously.
little bit I'm a little bit too prone to say yes to everything,
Sure, sure.
like TR.
Kind of.
That's where I take after him.
And I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that. Okay, so I have another like really I mean this is kind of a silly deal. You were a Supreme Court law clerk, is that right?
Yes.
And so this is in my and now I have no idea how this works. I'm very ignorant to the whole thing. But I get into this impression in my mind that you graduate from a prestigious law school, you're in the top X%, and 500 people fill out an application to be a Supreme Court law clerk. And the Supreme Court justice has his best friend pick three names out of a hat. And those are the guys that could become a Supreme Court law clerk. If as a law clerk, are you more just like an extra pair of eyes to do a copious amount of reading? Like, is that just like, are you a research nerd? Like, is that all you're doing as a Supreme Court law clerk? Or like, what are the responsibilities of somebody who's working in the Supreme Court like that?
Well, it depends on the justice. So different justices use their clerks in different ways.
Okay.
But generally speaking, yeah, you do a lot of research, and then you also get to like talk to the justice about how the case should come out, or you get to
Oh,
write
wow.
memos recommending how the justice should vote, which is like the really exciting part that everyone wants to do. And then I think the clerks have much less influence than they think or than they hope.
Mhm.
So you go in as a clerk and you're like, I'm going to change my justice's mind on
Yeah,
this topic, and
right.
I'm going to really influence the direction of constitutional law. And then you find out justice knows what they're going to do, and often they don't really need you.
Mhm.
I mean, the thing that I noticed most with Justice Souter was he would give me lots of assignments that felt really substantive and really important, but it was sort of more for my benefit than for his benefit
Ah,
because
okay.
he didn't really need me. It's possible that I maybe affected the way he thought about a couple of things a little bit, but the justice clerk relationship is not a relationship of equals.
No, no,
So
no,
yeah,
no,
it's
not at
more
all.
like student professor.
That
So
makes sense.
they they know what they're gonna do.
So I feel like, being a Supreme Court law clerk is like getting your PhD in law.
Um, sort of. I mean,
I
it's
mean, I feel as though it should be more rigorous, right? Is the work that you were doing there more rigorous than it was the work that you were doing in school?
um probably. I mean, it was pretty rigorous because if you were writing a draft opinion for your justice, there's probably someone on the other side, unless it's unanimous, which means that you're going to have one other justice's chambers or three other justices' chambers, like highly talented lawyers trying to pick apart everything that you've said,
Mm.
if they're disagreeing with you. So it's
As
pretty
well, you're trying to
rigorous
pick apart what they're
in
saying.
that sense. Yeah, you're like going back and forth with very talented lawyers. So that was rigorous.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. That's very fascinating. All right. So, since your great grandfather, Teddy Roosevelt's on the Mount Rushmore, I listen to lots of sports talk. So, like, my hobby in life is sports. I love the Kansas City Chiefs. We're right here in Kansas City, about an hour south. A big time sports fan. Royals, baseball, all that kind of stuff. And when I listen to sports talk radio, when it's the off season, they do this thing where they say, well, what's the Mount Rushmore of, and then they fill in the blank. So like they'll say, well, the Mount Rushmore of breakfast cereals. And so you have to pick four
Cheerios.
breakfast. Yeah, right. Exactly. Captain Crunch, and it's fine. Um, so they play this game of, build the Mount Rushmore of, right? Well,
Mhm.
since you're kind of already on the Mount Rushmore as far as presidents are concerned, what would be your Mount Rushmore of Supreme Court justices?
Uh, Interesting question. Do
Thank
you
you.
want like the best
I mean,
justices
this
or the
is your,
most
it's an opinion.
historically important,
It's your opinion. Whatever,
influential?
what do you think?
Well, I think probably you like John Marshall.
Okay.
Um, John Marshall has a lot of impact. Um, and then, I don't know, would I put Roger Taney there? I might put Roger Taney there also because of his historical significance, and we should acknowledge the bad as well as the good in our history.
Sure.
So Taney and Dred Scott tells us something important about
Yeah.
the Supreme Court and sort of what the court should and shouldn't do and what it's likely to do. So, I probably would put Tawny there. And then uh, probably Earl Warren. Like the Warren Court is another
Mm,
hugely significant historical era in the Supreme Court's history. And I think that we made a mistake for a long time of not realizing how unusual and exceptional the Warren Court was, how rare it is historically that the Supreme Court actually tries to protect the politically weak. Because usually it doesn't do that. Usually the Supreme Court serves the people who are in power politically, which is more what we're seeing now. So Marshall, Taney, Warren, and then David Souter. I could for Souter. I love Souter because David Souter shows you like the great justice who doesn't think about his own reputation or legacy and cares about the system and the process rather than the individual. And so you should have someone up there representing that aspect of the court too.
there you
Like
go.
all the justices who did their job because they thought it was the right thing to do, not because they were trying to get future generations to put up statues of them.
Now I know
Sort
that,
of ironic, but I do it.
yeah, but I mean, like, okay, so in my naive way of thinking, like the Supreme Court is really just there to uphold the laws that the Senate writes. Like, right? And
Well,
like in that
no.
like so
It's there
like
to interpret the laws that the Senate writes, but it's also there to decide whether the laws that the Senate writes and that state legislatures write are constitutional or not.
okay. All right. So okay. So that's the way more clear way of thinking about it. Because they're not enforcing, they're interpreting more. I guess is the
Yeah.
better word to put it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
Yeah.
uh that is really interesting. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much for that, by the way. One other thing that I like to do, and then this is going to be it because I know you have a more important life to live, but I do this thing with my students once a week where we do a reflection log. I think reflecting is probably the most important piece to learning and education. And so I do a reflection log where I ask, different questions about, the week that was. But I always ask a rose, a seed, and a thorn, right? So what was the best thing that happened? What was the worst thing that happened? And what is something that you've learned? So I would like to ask you that same thing, but more concerning the book that you wrote, the New Nation book that you wrote. What is the best thing that you've experienced when you were writing that book? What's the worst thing that you experienced while writing that book? And what is something that you learned while writing that book?
Hmm. Well, it's a little hard maybe to talk about the best and worst thing that I experienced. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah.
But
Like
I
maybe it was
guess
the
like
idea, maybe it was the
the
process of
most,
writing, or I don't know.
well, I guess I would say like the best thing and the worst thing are also things that I learned about American history.
Okay.
So the worst thing was I learned how deeply unfair America has been for so much of its history, and sort of so deliberately, and all while saying that we're doing something else, all while saying that we're dedicated to equality and opportunity for everyone. We're actually focusing opportunity on a limited group of people. And very often this is racial. So that was the bad thing. But then there are also incredible inspirational figures in American history. And, I do think Theodore Roosevelt is one, but also like, looking at Reconstruction, um, there are people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and then there's people like Frederick Douglass and the black senators and representatives of Reconstruction, Blanche Bruce and Hiram Revels, and Harriet Tubman is an unbelievable American story. So there are also these incredible, uplifting, inspiring parts of American history. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of that I didn't know. I mean, it's an incredible story.
Yeah.
The more you learn. So, in some ways I learned America's worse than I thought. In some ways I learned America's better than I thought. And then the thing that I would learn about, or the lesson that I would take going forward, is we can tell an American story that focuses on the good and not the bad, and we can claim the good and not the bad, and it's even more accurate too. It's a truer story. So there's a story of America that is more truthful, more inclusive, and more inspiring than the one that we're telling now.
No, wow. That's really interesting. That is really cool and very powerful. Kermit, thank you so much for your time today, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you for giving me an insight to what you've experienced, and I very much look forward to getting a national park here, inviting you to come and dedicate that park, and getting a chance to meet you, and hopefully get a chance to share some barbecue with you.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
That
I'd
would
love
be
to.
so cool.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
Let me know.
yeah, I will absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of your summer, sir.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you. All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.